Hi, I'm Mark, and today I want to talk again about the harsh recent British approach towards migrants. As I said often enough, whataboutism is complete nonsense, but I will give you a comparison with some developments in the EU today as well for a broader picture. But that doesn't make the British policy any better. Human rights organizations have repeatedly criticized Britain's new migration law, but the Conservative government around Prime Minister Sunak is sticking to the reform, and it will miss out on its actual plan with it. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from the UNHCR believes that Britain's illegal migration bill will now be discussed in the House of Lords after it was passed in the House of Commons. That could crush the international refugee protection system through a domino effect among hostile countries. Already, the governments of Denmark and New Zealand were imitating British asylum policies, or the British Denmark, but which in turn are copying Australia's notorious offshoring, that means the resettlement of refugees. The draft law provides for the deportation of spontaneously arriving asylum seekers and victims of human trafficking or other forms of abuse, and the rejection of their applications. The detention, which is incontestable for 28 days for asylum seekers, should also be allowed until deportation. At the same time, legal protective measures that restrict the detention of vulnerable people, such as children and pregnant women, are being undermined. And judges cannot prevent or delay deportations, and ministers can simply ignore judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, they say. Asylum-seeking children must undergo scientific X-rays to determine bone age or are treated as adults. The new law also legalizes the previously illegal confiscation of phones, and in short, asylum seekers have no right to privacy. And they are no longer entitled to humane treatment. New laws were passed last year following court rulings that declared the conditions of detention for asylum seekers unlawful. These allow for longer short-term incarceration. At the same time, standards for healthcare, legal advice, communication, and sleeping facilities have been drastically lowered, and the obligation to screen asylum seekers for signs of torture and illness has been lifted. In addition, the Conservative government under Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is changing other planning and housing laws. This legalized the accommodation of asylum seekers under dangerous and unsanitary conditions in barracks or tent cities. Studies have repeatedly shown that suicide, self-harm, and neglect increase under such conditions. In April, more than 830 health professionals and medical institutions warned of the catastrophic mental and physical damage of these new rules. Despite harsh criticism, the government is making few corrections to the planned law. Only the detention and deportation of unaccompanied children have been subsequently restricted, and information about legal and safe escape routes is to be provided 6 months after it has come into force. Refugee organizations have repeatedly complained that there are practically no safe or legal routes for refugees to come there if they are not from Ukraine or Hong Kong. 3/4 of all asylum decisions made in the past year were positive, by the way. Afghans, Syrians, Iraqis, Iranians, and many Albanian victims of human trafficking came into the country. Their need for protection is obvious in view of the positive asylum decisions. The government is trying to prevent precisely these people from entering the country with its Stop the Boats campaign. The government, on the other hand, does not mention Great Britain's role in the causes of flight. Military adventures, arms trafficking with regimes that violate human rights, the destruction of the environment, and livelihoods. The illegal in the title refers to refugees and migrants who enter in violation of immigration regulations, that means without a visa. But that wasn't at least forbidden for a long time. It was only made a criminal offense last year with the Citizenship and Borders Act. But that alone is a violation of the Geneva Refugee Convention, which prohibits the punishment of refugees arriving irregularly. The arrival is still illegal, but it can't be punished. The new asylum law also shows how extreme the government's attitude has become in just 1 year. While last year's migration law still allowed the resettlement of asylum seekers, the upcoming law on illegal migration explicitly requires it. The current reform is therefore not only illegal, but also the culmination of decades of resistance to the principles of the international human rights framework of the United Nations. And this undermines the rule of law and violates international obligations. All major concerns are ignored there, but all warnings from the British human rights authorities, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister Gordon Brown and Theresa May, and the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights are completely ignored in Westminster. However, the draft law is hardly feasible anyway. It will create an enormous new administrative burden for demoralized, unqualified, and underqualified personnel. Even before the law was introduced, the speed with which asylum applications are decided has led to an enormous backlog of applications. Applicants must therefore wait up to 5 years for a decision. And above all, the law, despite all the deterrent maneuvers, will not stop the boats. We know that from past years. It will only make the journey more expensive and more dangerous. But why all this? It is in the end governing through spectacle. Downing Street wants to win the upcoming general election and hopes to be able to do so in this way. However, the local elections have only just shown that this approach deters more moderate Tory voters. But London is now using Brexit for a tough defense against refugees, and the EU has also been tightening the rules for years. And as I promised, I would now also like to talk about a few developments within the EU. London, like all 27 member states of the European Union, signed the Geneva Refugee Convention. But many try not to have to use them in the first place by trying to keep refugees away. The states on the Mediterranean are constantly increasing the hurdles for arriving migrants or closing rescue ports. Poland treats war refugees with double standards depending on their origin. And in Sweden, the changed attitude of the European Union's welcome culture is particularly evident. But today I'm gonna start in Greece. After the parliamentary elections in 2019, the new conservative government in Athens passed an extremely tightened asylum law. It extended the list of cases in which the authorities could reject an asylum application as manifestly unfounded without further examination and shortened application deadlines. The law increased the documentation requirements for refugees to a level that, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, they could not reasonably achieve, and thus excluded them from an asylum procedure which was difficult to access anyway. At the same time, the acceptance rate for those who declared all of these hurdles fell from 55.9% to 33% in the first year. All refugees who fall under the EU-Turkey agreement are not allowed to leave their island of arrival in the Aegean, which led to overcrowding and catastrophic living conditions, for example in Moria camp on Lesbos, the largest and 10 times overcrowded camp in Europe, which refugees in September burned down in 2020. And then we come to Italy. Although a particularly large number of refugees arrive in Italy, the country is the only EU member that does not have uniform asylum legislation. More than 20 centers in the country take care of newcomers according to their possibilities. The then Interior Minister Matteo Salvini reduced the funds from the radical right-wing Lega in 2018, and in cooperation with civil society and church welfare, which however cannot compensate for the gaps in state care. Aid organizations complain that access to the asylum procedure and decent housing is not guaranteed and is often impossible. 10 years ago, Italian politicians were still proud of the Mare Nostrum rescue mission for shipwrecked people, at which time more than 150,000 people were saved. Since 2016, sea rescue has become increasingly difficult. The Social Democratic government under Paolo Gentiloni tightened the rules for NGO rescue ships and, with the help of Libyan militias and the government, temporarily reduced landings in Italy by 80%. Salvini later temporarily closed the ports. The most recent ship disaster in Calabria at the end of February, which probably killed 100 people, brought at least one rhetorical change. Two ministers in the Meloni government promised humanitarian corridors and legalized labor migration. In concrete terms, only harsher penalties are planned for those who help escape. And then we come to Spain. The images of high fences around the North African exclave of Ceuta and Melilla are immediately present, but those who make it into the country have many legally guaranteed rights thanks to the Asylum Act of 2009. It provides protection against deportation until the asylum procedure is completely and dignified support for subsistence and medical care. For the procedure, asylum seekers have free legal advice and the help of translators. They can view their files at any time, and their application will be reported to the UN Refugee Agency. After 6 months in the country, they are allowed to work. Aid organizations see, among other things, the time until the official registration of an asylum application as problematic, though. During this time, sometimes several months, asylum seekers have no verifiable right of residence, and Spain is also trying to keep those seeking protection away as much as possible, including through a readmission agreement with Morocco. And then we have Malta. Malta is even closer to the neighboring African continent than Italy is, and is therefore their first European destination for many refugees. 8 years ago, the small EU member country with its 500,000 inhabitants gave itself a strategy for the reception of asylum seekers and irregular migrants, which, however, 3 years later, in the face of a record high of 1,445 arrivals, the following year, in 2019, it was then 3,406, came under stress. Since then, the reception centers have only allowed stays if there's space available. Families are allowed to stay for a year, single men for half a year, both regardless of the status of their asylum process. Even if they find work and housing, they fall into a state of quasi-lawlessness afterwards. And the number of those who are recognized as entitled to asylum is extremely low. In 2021, it fell to an all-time low of just 8%, and not a single rejection was withdrawn in the second instance. Although the numbers have fallen sharply to 832 people in 2021 and half as many last year, the Maltese government is continuing its defense policy. ECHR, the coalition of 140 European NGOs involved in migration policy, reports that Malta is not servicing its own rescue zone south of the Italian island of Lampedusa, and is even blocking boats from entering it. The island state hardly ever allows refugees to land, especially if non-governmental organizations have taken them in at sea. And I mentioned Sweden before, and I want to talk about Sweden now. In Scandinavia, the culture of welcome is finally history with the takeover of power by the right-wing conservative minority government last autumn. Sweden already tightened its asylum rules after the great refugee movement in 2015. Even then, it restricted family reunification, issued more temporary residence permits, and increasingly deported people to what they call safe third countries. The new government under Ulf Kristersson is now sending the next signal of toughness. A large part of the coalition agreement focuses on the paradigm shift in Swedish migration policy promised during the election campaign, and comes mostly from the pen of the right-wing Sweden Democrats. From 2024, residence permits should also be limited without exception, and residence titles that have already been issued should be revoked more easily. In principle, Sweden should not be more generous than the European Union when it comes to asylum policy, and migration should be restricted to an absolute minimum. The number of new refugees is to be reduced by more than 80% in the coming years. Even the possible withdrawal of various social benefits is reviewed in the current legislature. Sweden's government also caused a stir with a vague formulation that non-Swedes with poor character should be deported as quickly as possible. In Stockholm, this includes general violations of the rules as well as prostitution or drug abuse. And then we come to Poland. In 2015 and 2016, Warsaw fiercely resisted the admission or more equitable distribution of Syrian war refugees in Europe. Since the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, Poland has shown its more humane side. The country has taken in over 1.5 million people since February 22. There are more Ukrainian refugees in no other European country, except Ukraine. According to the UNHCR, the Polish government introduced a completely digital residence permit last summer in order to be able to cope with this. It is issued to all Ukrainian citizens who crossed the Polish-Ukrainian border on or after February 24th in 2022. With the electronic document, Ukrainians can move freely in the Schengen area. However, the situation on the eastern EU external border shows that there was no fundamental change in asylum policy in Warsaw. Poland is trying to stop people seeking protection who want to enter via Belarus by building a 400-kilometer border fence financed by EU funds, which they haven't granted yet. There have been tens of thousands of illegal pushbacks there since 2021. In the same year, the country tightened its immigration law. Since then, the authorities have been allowed to reject any application for international protection if the applicant was caught immediately after crossing the border without permission. At the time, the United Nations criticized the law as undermining the right to asylum. The UN Special Rapporteur Felipe González Morales praised Warsaw in the summer for its solidarity with Ukrainian refugees, but at the same time warned the country to end the dangerous practice of illegal pushbacks on the border with Belarus. And here in Germany, there's also a lot of discussion, right down to the repulsive statements made by those fascists in our Bundestag. But if you want to talk about more regulated immigration and dealing with the right to asylum on the basis of the law, you need more global measures and a very clear distinction. Asylum seekers, war refugees, and immigrants are all terms that refer to people migrating to another country. However, the main difference between them lies in their respective motivations and circumstances of migration. Asylum seekers are people fleeing a country where they are being persecuted because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinions, or membership of a particular social group, or even their sexual orientation. They apply for asylum in another country in order to receive protection and safety from persecution. Asylum seekers are usually referred to as those seeking protection. And then we have the war refugees. War refugees are people who are forced to leave their homes because of war or armed conflicts. They are fleeing violence, destruction, and threats that threaten their lives and those of their families. War refugees are often forced to leave their homes quickly and without many of their belongings. And then there are immigrants. Immigrants are people who move to another country to live and work. Immigrants usually have a positive motivation, such as better educational or job opportunities, or the prospect of a better life for themselves and their families. Immigrants can move to another country voluntarily and often have the opportunity to plan and prepare for their migration. Overall, there are different reasons and conditions why people migrate to another countries. Asylum seekers and war refugees are often forced to leave their homes to protect their lives and to get security, while immigrants often migrate voluntarily in search of better opportunities and living conditions. And this distinction makes action necessary, but always within the bounds of the law. This ranges from a faster decision making and even, yes, deportation in the event of rejection to possible, or it can even come to possible central checkpoints at the borders, and proper immigration law, which my country does not yet have. But I have to emphasize again and again, international law must be observed here. And I'll be sure to talk about the German discussion again on Outside Views magazines in the near future on one Thursday, because on Thursday Germany is the topic there. But all those countries I brought up today doesn't make anything of what I told you about Poland or whatever makes it better what's happening in the UK. It is as wrong in the UK as some things were wrong in Denmark, which they moved away from recently, or which might happen in Sweden, and which happened in Poland and happened in Greece. Nothing makes this better. If one person breaks the international law, it doesn't give a free ticket for anybody else to break international law. And the British government is doing it more and more. And here on this channel, I talk about the British government. So this today was an exception just for a broader picture. But for the broader picture, I usually have my Outside Views magazine channel. And if you're not interested in looking at another channel, don't ask on this channel about other countries. This is not the channel for other countries. But I'll see you in my next video or in Outside Views magazines. I'll be back.